Hello, everyone. I'm Kent Drummond, the relatively new director of Saturday University. And here with me today is Professor Jean Garrison from the Department of Political Science, who is an expert in US-China relations. And in fact, it was 2 years ago about this time that Professor Garrison gave a knockout lecture at both Gillette and Sheridan on US-China relations. Well, in our relatively new tradition of updating and ongoing content, posting content here, we felt that it was really time not only to repost Dr. Garrison's lecture from that time, but to have a brief conversation, really updating in light of recent events, what is going on now between the US and China. And so what I'd like to do is just prompt Dr. Garrison with a question about how would you change, what would you add to this lecture that you gave 2 years ago in light of COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, thanks so much, Kent. It's really fun to reach out and do some follow-up. And oddly enough, this is kind of the silver lining to COVID-19, that we're learning to reach out and use the technology at our fingertips. And in some ways, this technology, I'll just start with that point, that this technology and the interconnectedness that we have in the world has brought us closer to everyone, including China, but it also creates rough spots. And, we know a lot. And I just want to say up front that one of probably the positive trends that mitigates against hostility, growing hostility or deep-seated hostility toward China on both sides, whether it's Chinese looking at the US or US looking at China, is actually because we've had a lot of deep people-to-people relations. And of course, that's the role of a university. We have, close to 200 Chinese students on the US, on the UW campus, and of course, hundreds of thousands around the world. So I just want to note that, because the University of Wyoming is very much a comprehensive international-oriented university. And actually, we rely on those exchanges to actually come up with solutions to challenges, including research, sharing research on things like COVID-19. So that's my introduction to just kind of pose it and respond back to how you raised the question. And when I look back over the last 2 years to bring it forward from the lecture that I gave, and I hope everybody has had an opportunity to take a look at it. Maybe if you haven't, take a look at it. So many of the trends noted there, which are that this is a complicated, competitive, sometimes confrontational, sometimes friendly relationship with China. And those trends, that mixture of trends is still going on. And the kinds of situations that lead to mistrust and confusion are still in place. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about a continued huge imbalance in the trade relationship with China. It's about the same 4-to-1 that it was, in 2018. It's actually widened slightly. The spending gap between the U.S. Spends $700+ billion a year on its military, to China, which spends $260+ billion. We never know exactly the accuracy of Chinese data, but if you double it, it's still well below what the United States spends. But that's a huge increase over time, which causes a lot of concern in the United States. And if you're China, you look at it from the perspective of, well, they spend twice or 3 times what we spend. And so, each side, when they have concerns, can point to these data as points of concern. And so I would say we still have, and probably only increased in the last 2 years, increasing mistrust. It's fear. And there's been a lot of really interesting writing in publications like Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy. And they pose this question: is this a new Cold War? Well, the reason I raise that is because I just want to point out a couple of differences there. One of the differences is that when we look at the rise of the Cold War with the Soviet Union after World War II, we had a situation where the United States had about 50% of the world GNP. And we were in a huge advantageous place. We were rebuilding institutions. We were the Marshall Plan. We were rebuilding kind of the world that supported our way of life, and we did get into a rivalry, obviously, with the Soviet Union, but they were very much cut off economically. They, not saying they weren't a threat, but we weren't interdependent the way we are today. So as we borrow, just as one example, our way out of some of the challenges and economic challenges post COVID-19, as we provide trillions of dollars in aid, much needed aid, to our citizens and our businesses, where does that come from? Well, a lot of that is actually foreign bought bonds, and it's largely China. So what I heard very recently, I heard a slew of examples of kind of how do we, this was actually Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina in the last couple of days, how do we influence China? You know, if we're concerned about China, how do we kind of influence China to be maybe more of a player along the lines of the kind of world we want to see, you know, a liberal economic order, et cetera. And I think that we don't have the same basket of options that we used to have. What we do have going for us is that in this interdependent relationship, China is dependent on on us buying their goods. And, you know, we're dependent on them buying our debt or lending us money for our debt. We have supply chains, which I know have been a concern because of some of the medical supplies, et cetera. So we have some interesting trends going on, but we also have a pretty complicated relationship, which is not necessarily comfortable all of the time. And we, on our side, on the US side, we are increasingly isolating ourselves, actually, oddly enough. We are isolating ourselves within international institutions that we built to promote our interests. We sometimes have rather, ups and downs and friction with our allies, whether they're in Europe or in East Asia. And I think one of the things I was pointing to in that lecture was that as you have that growing gap, in terms of what is the US role in the world and what do people want, American citizens want the American role to be in the world, we have simultaneously an expectation that we can do a lot. And yet I think we're on a trend where we have fewer options. And we have a rising China, which is very wealthy. It's seen as absolutely necessary for the economies of many of its neighbors. And at the same time, they also share many of our concerns. So you'll see the neighbors, and I'm gonna, in a minute here, I'll talk about some very recent Pew Global Attitude Survey data. But what we really see is it's a mixed bag. It requires us to have a series of experts that really look across any number of issues and recognize that there are real places where it is in our best interest to cooperate, and the Chinese would see it the same way. But at the same time, we have areas where we don't see eye to eye, and we have different interests. And so it's a complicated relationship that doesn't fall well into, it doesn't work into us them the way it did in the early Cold War scenario, but it doesn't mean it's not complicated and fractious. And I would say watchful and trying to encourage as much as possible. And it's a tough time because they are, getting very close to us in terms of our economic size. They have a lot of cash reserves. They've been hit hard by this virus too. But I just hope that there's a softening in some of the leadership. I mean, there's pretty hardline leadership in China right now, and that's come to the fore. But I still think there's a lot of mixed perspectives in China, and I think about how do we encourage those voices and try to get to a place where they can see that it's in their interest as well. And so that's the perspective I have. That's a long answer to your question.
Well, that's all right. It's a complicated question and certainly requires a lot of nuanced thinking as well. At the risk of oversimplifying, let me ask you, is China's success a threat to the US?
Oh, yeah.
See it in those terms?
Yeah, well, I was the one who posed that question, wasn't it, in that lecture in Gillette and Sheridan, because I was trying to be controversial and try to put a point on it. And I think my answer then was, and I don't think it's really changed, is it kind of depends on how you see the world. And so if you see the world from a perspective that the world is zero sum and it is us versus them, then the answer is yes. If you see the world from the perspective of that maybe you can work together and have share common interests, then the answer is no, or certainly maybe. And then maybe you get to my complicated, kind of my complicated analysis. I'm just going to say that personally, I sit in the middle, and that's why I gave you that nuanced answer earlier on and said, depending on what you're looking at and why you need to be vigilant. But I think what I would say is either way, it is not prudent to poke the tiger too hard because the consequences are such that we're not in the same kind of strong position that we were 60 years ago, even 30 years ago. And that's because of the rise of China and the relative decline of the United States. That's only in relative to others rising. It's just, to me, that's lose-lose. And I would say, we are a mature power. We understand that we are a complicated country. We have mixed interests. And it's just really important from my perspective as someone who's watched the China relationship for a long time, is to just not ever get into or be careful of single issue focused analyses, because if you focus just on human rights, then you're getting, it's really thorny and terribly different from some of the values we hold. If you look at, increasing military spending, same thing. So that's why I come back to being vigilant and just recognizing we live in a complicated world. And when you are a complicated world with multiple great powers, honestly, because China really is a rising great power, that it is absolutely in our best interest to manage it, to counter them when we can, but also to work with them when we can. And I think that both of those situations exist simultaneously. Can I share a little bit of data, maybe what I've been looking at recently with
Please
folks?
do.
So I just pulled up, and I encourage everybody to go look at this. The Pew Research Center does a global attitude survey, and the most recent one that you can access actually is from March. It was published in April, but the survey of a few dozen countries was actually completed between March 3rd and March 27th, roughly. And what you find when you Google that, and this is all available online, what you really find is a sharp hardening of attitudes toward China in the United States and Canada, by the way. For those of you who watch the news, the detention of the Huawei executive, and then the detention of a couple of Canadians. It's really put it's really put the relationship between Canada and China on pins and needles. But what you see is just very high unfavorable ratings in North America. You see a decline in positive attitudes, actually a rise in negative attitudes toward China across Western Europe. There are exceptions in places like Russia. There's a lot of negativity, rising negativity in the region. I think I talked, a couple of years ago about that in East Asia, when countries think about China's rising military spending, they get very concerned. But when they focus on their economic power, because the bleed effect of investment in China having a positive bleed over into many of the economies of East Asia and Southeast Asia, you get a difference. So in the sense, you ask the question differently, and you already see that people see it differently depending on what gets primed. And but really high negatives in places like Japan, even Indonesia, which has traditionally been quite positive, and was a couple of years ago more even. You have rising unfavorable. So there's a lot of concern. And keep in mind, these are our treaty allies in many cases. So that's again back to my point about having having our ability to project our power in East Asia and Southeast Asia, it might be a little bit on the decline. And so we have to keep that in mind. I think that that's interesting. I didn't look again at the comparison between kind of attitudes towards the United States and attitudes toward China globally, but I think in general that's, there's been a softening in the appeal of the United States globally. But the one thing that's different about a rising China, even though they're a huge economic power, second leading economy, et cetera, they don't have the same soft power appeal that the United States has. Now that's in decline across the world. Thinking about the United States, soft power is about the attractiveness of your way of life and your political system, and kind of, do people want to emulate what you do? And that's softened over the last couple of years. And that's a cost to some of the rhetoric, kind of the hardening of some rhetoric across, NATO and some allies, some of the unpredictability. But China doesn't have that same appeal. And that is something that's really in the US favor. I mean, there's a well of goodwill for the United States and its role. And I think that we still have that. And that's something to keep in mind, that could be strengthened. So I'm not giving clear answers, but part of that is because I guess I'd come back to one final thought on this question, is that I understand why people are concerned about China. I understand why we're concerned about hacking, which essentially is industrial espionage generally. It's often related to pretty aggressive attempts at our technology, and recent reports about concerns about Iran and China. That's my message about being watchful. I have no interest in having us be naive to this. And I think, however, that as humans, we like simpler answers. And I'm saying it's time for us to accept that there aren't, the simple answers maybe aren't as clear as we might think. And just be careful to always reassess, because we want to make sure whatever we do and however we respond, that it is the best choice to actually get us to what we want to see as a policy outcome. And I'm just not a fan of automatic escalation, particularly because we're so interdependent. I just see it as, tanking our economy simultaneously. And we're already living through a tough time. So it's a fine line, on this. And let me say one final thing before you might pose another question. That is, there's what you do in public and say in public, and there's what you do behind the scenes. And what I recognize, this is mid-May when we're filming this, and mid-May of 2020. And what I would say is what we're entering into is campaign rhetoric on China. And that is typical. And when you get into campaign rhetoric on China, it is more of the zero-sum language. It's very black and white. We've heard it across, Clinton did it to go after George H.W. Bush, did it on human rights. George W. Bush did it in the campaign. So this is absolutely typical. And so, I think this is something that the Chinese leadership understands. They might not say it publicly, but I think they understand the nature of the American political system. But keep in mind that China has its own agenda, right? And they play to their domestic audience. People in China are very proud of where they've come, how far they've come. It's in the interest of the Chinese Communist Party for people to, sometimes they stir up nationalism. They do it for domestic purposes. So I think we shouldn't underestimate how people in China feel about when they feel like they've been dissed, so to speak. And I think we need to recognize that. And maybe we need to recognize that they're gonna have some rhetoric too. And the proof is in the pudding. The proof is in the actual policies. One of my concerns is there's an awful lot of positions in the State Department, for example, that have not been filled. And so when you have a dearth of expertise in the policy, in where these policies are made, sometimes it escalates crises a little bit more. And that's one concern I've had over the last several years. And I remember thinking that Barack Obama took so long to fill these posts, and he did. He was slower than his predecessors. Well, President Trump has been slow in that as well, and I think had a perspective that we didn't need all those positions. I guess I would advocate differently and say it's important to have experts in those positions to inform decisions made in the White House. That's been my perspective on kind of all the work I've done across the presidents vis-a-vis China from Nixon forward.
Well, that's a very complex answer, but a good one. Here we are at a university where we avoid the easy answers and go for more nuance and critical analysis.
And can I say that the reason that we do these things, the reason we have these talks, is to provide our judgment, which is based on our study. And I realize it's a little bit of a if then this kind of a discussion, but then I think our purpose is to inform people and have people think about what they think. And because I would say, let me just give a general criticism of the conduct and the making of American foreign policy, which predates President Trump. I would say since the end of the Cold War, the foreign policy elite have made very little attempt to involve the American people in a dialogue for what the US role in the world should be. And we just assumed a continuation of action, whether it was, trade and military, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, and this comes out, by the way, I think this, but I've seen it in the polling data. Over the last 20 years, you've seen a softening in the desire of Americans to be the world policeman. And so that complicates this scenario too, because not only have we not had the discussion, which by the way, in my opinion, is essential in a democracy, that you have an open discussion about what should be the role of America in the world. And we haven't done that. And I think, we're kind of at the point where you kind of see what the result has been. And I think President Trump, in many ways, was elected on that tide. It was a reflection of something that has a fairly broad-based support across Americans. And by the way, it doesn't fit neatly into left-right. And this gets into kind of the 20 years of wars and some people, being tired of that, kind of the endless wars in the Middle East. And I think that I really encourage citizens to really demand this dialogue, because it's our dollars that go into these policies, and having that kind of, even if it's support for a more robust role in the world, that's essential to the success of the United States and the president who supports that policy focus. So I guess my closing message is just that, unless you have another question, is that this is a complicated relationship. It is the single most important relationship the United States has, and we're muddling through it. And I'm always encouraged that we have multiple contact levels with China across the U.S. government, the Chinese government. So a lot of times there's a lot of signaling going on publicly, and there's progress behind the scenes. So I continue to be encouraged by that.
Well, I think that's a great way to end this update and an introduction to the lecture that you gave, which we are now posting. So I encourage all of our viewers to check that out again, see what's changed in light of the pandemic, and take into account Dr. Garrison's update today, and put it all together, and look forward to not only new postings of Saturday University, but new events coming to a location near you.
Yes, at least live streamed to a location near you, potentially in your living rooms. And I welcome anybody to drop me an email. It's simply garrison@uwyo.edu, or just comment, maybe even more interesting, comment on the post, and we'll see the dialogue that comes through in Facebook.
That'd be fabulous, just what we'd like. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Garrison. We really appreciate it.
Good to see you. You're welcome. Thank you very much.